February 2022, Manhattan. Michael Reeves has spent 18 months researching a book about New York City's darkest decade, the 1970s, when the city teetered on the edge of collapse, when crime ruled the streets and corruption owned City Hall. He's interviewed retired cops, aging mobsters, survivors of an era that most New Yorkers prefer to forget. But nothing has prepared him for what he finds in Box 847. The records are from the 72nd Precinct in Brooklyn, covering 1973, a year when 14 men connected to organized crime vanished from the Red Hook neighborhood without explanation. The disappearances were investigated briefly before the cases were closed, with a notation that Michael has never seen in his years of research. No PROCESAR, Órdenes superiores, do not process, orders from above. Someone had decided that 14 missing mobsters weren't worth investigating. Someone had buried these cases so thoroughly that they hadn't surfaced in nearly 50 years of organized crime research, mob trials, or historical inquiries. Michael digs deeper into the box and finds a single sheet of paper, handwritten, tucked into a folder marked Malone. These men did what we couldn't do. God forgive them, and God forgive us for looking the other way. Dedo F. Kowalski, badge, the Spol 471, the Malones. A family name that Michael recognizes from old Brooklyn directories. Malone Brothers Moving and Storage, a company that operated in Red Hook from 1945 until sometime in the 1980s. A moving company, 14 missing mobsters, and a detective who had chosen to look the other way. Michael has just found the story that will define his career, if he can survive telling it. The Malone family had been in Red Hook since the Irish arrived. They had come from County Cork in the 1880s, part of the great wave of immigration that transformed Brooklyn from a collection of villages into a borough of millions. The first Malones had worked the docks, unloading ships, hauling cargo, building the infrastructure that made New York the commercial capital of the world. By 1973, the family had been in Red Hook for nearly a century, long enough to see the neighborhood rise from immigrant slum to working-class respectability and then decline again as the shipping industry abandoned the waterfront for container ports in New Jersey. Malone Brothers Moving and Storage occupied a brick warehouse on Von Brunt Street, 3 blocks from the piers where Seamus Malone had spent 20 years as a longshoreman before his back gave out, and he used his savings to buy 3 trucks and start a business. That was 1945. 28 years later, the company employed 12 workers, operated 7 trucks, and handled everything from apartment moves to piano deliveries to the occasional job that required discretion. Moving safes, transporting valuables, handling cargo that clients preferred not to discuss. Seamus Malone was 67 years old and still came to work every day. He was a broad man, thick through the shoulders and chest despite his age, with hands that had been shaped by decades of physical labor. His hair had gone white, his face was lined with years of sun and wind, but his eyes remained sharp, the eyes of a man who had survived the Depression, the waterfront wars, the systematic corruption that had defined Brooklyn for as long as anyone could remember. He had buried a wife in 1962 and a son in 1951. He had built a business that supported 3 surviving sons, a nephew, and a dozen employees who depended on him. He had resisted the protection rackets that squeezed every small business in the neighborhood, had refused to pay tribute to men who had never lifted anything heavier than an envelope full of cash. That resistance had cost him. Trucks vandalized, tires slashed, a warehouse fire in 1968 that had destroyed $50,000 worth of stored goods. But Seamus had rebuilt every time, had refused to bend, had earned a reputation as a man who couldn't be intimidated. The Colombo family had eventually decided he wasn't worth the trouble. An old Irishman with a moving company wasn't worth a war, not when there were easier targets, more profitable enterprises, bigger fish to fry. That calculation was about to change. Michael Reeves tracked down Detective Francis Kowalski on his 3rd attempt. The former detective was 85 years old, living in a nursing home in Staten Island, his mind sharp despite a body that had been failing for years. He had served 32 years with the NYPD, most of them in Brooklyn, retiring in 1989 with a pension and a collection of memories that he had never shared with anyone. "I knew someone would come eventually," Kowalski said, when Michael explained why he was visiting. 50 years is a long time to keep a secret, but secrets have a way of surfacing. especially the ones that deserve to. The Malone case? You wrote that note, the one about them doing what you couldn't do. I wrote that note the night I closed the investigation, February 1974, about 4 months after the last disappearance. I'd figured out what happened by then, or most of it anyway. I knew who was responsible. I knew where the bodies probably were. Kowalski's voice was steady, matter of fact. And I made a decision that I've lived with ever since. You decided not to pursue it. I decided that justice had already been served. Those 14 men, they weren't innocent victims. They were soldiers in the Colombo organization, enforcers and collectors and leg breakers who had terrorized Red Hook for years. They had beaten shop owners, burned buildings, put 2 men in the hospital and 1 in the ground. The neighborhood had been living in fear of them for as long as anyone could remember. And then they disappeared. And then they disappeared, one by one over the course of 4 months. And suddenly, Red Hook was peaceful. Suddenly, shop owners could operate without paying protection. Suddenly, people could walk the streets without looking over their shoulders. Kowalski's eyes met Michael's. I had a choice. I could pursue the investigation, arrest the Malones, send them to prison for doing what the police and the courts had failed to do. Or I could close the cases, bury the files, and let the neighborhood have the peace it had earned. You chose peace. I chose justice, real justice, not the kind that comes from the courtrooms and plea bargains, the kind that comes from ordinary people standing up and saying, enough. Kowalski paused. Was I right? I've asked myself that question every day for 50 years. I still don't have an answer. The theft happened on October 3rd, 1973. Patrick Malone had been driving the GMC delivery truck, a 1968 model with Malone Brothers painted on the sides in faded green letters. The cargo was a full household, furniture, boxes, appliances, the accumulated possessions of a family named Castellano, who were relocating from Red Hook to Bay Ridge. And hidden beneath the furniture, in a false compartment that Patrick's brother Declan had built into the truck bed, was $80,000 in cash. The money belonged to Vincent Castellano, who had just sold his grocery store after 40 years of operation. He had taken the payment in cash, a common practice for business sales in that era, especially among people who preferred to avoid the attention of the IRS. The Malones had been moving valuables for clients for years, no questions asked, and Castellano had trusted them to transport his life savings along with his furniture. The hijacking happened on Hamilton Avenue, 3 blocks from the Gowanus Expressway. A black sedan cut off the truck, forcing Patrick to brake hard. Before he could react, 2 men emerged from the sedan, one holding a pistol, the other carrying a crowbar. A third man appeared at the driver's window, weapon drawn. Out of the truck, now. Patrick complied. He was 40 years old, unarmed, facing 3 men with guns. Resistance would have been suicide. He stepped out with his hands raised, watched as one of the men climbed into the cab. Listened as the engine roared and his truck disappeared down Hamilton Avenue. He memorized faces. He memorized voices. He memorized the license plate of the sedan, which peeled away seconds after the truck vanished. Then he walked 3 miles back to Red Hook to tell his father what had happened. The Castellano money was the target, Kowalski explained. Someone had tipped off the Colombo crew that the Malones were moving a large amount of cash. The furniture was incidental. They probably dumped it somewhere and kept the money. Who was the tip-off? We never confirmed it, but I always suspected it was someone at the grocery store. Castellano had employees, had people who knew his business, who knew he was selling and taking cash. Word gets around in a neighborhood like Red Hook. It reaches the wrong ears. And the Colombo crew, you identified them? Eventually, the men who actually did the hijacking were soldiers in a crew run by a capo named Salvatore Benedetto. Benedetto controlled Red Hook, had been squeezing the neighborhood for 15 years. His people handled protection, loan sharking, numbers, the usual rackets. How many men did Benedetto have? In his immediate crew, about 14. Enforcers, collectors, drivers, the operational guys who actually did the dirty work. Kowalski paused. 14 men, the same number who disappeared over the following months. The Malones took them all? The Malones took every last one, systematically, methodically, like they were working through a list, which, I later learned, they were. The family meeting happened the night of the theft. Seamus gathered his sons and nephew in the warehouse office, a cramped room with a metal desk, filing cabinets, and a window that looked out on the loading dock. The walls were covered with photographs, the original Malone trucks from 1945, family gatherings, a portrait of Liam in his army uniform taken 6 months before Korea. They took the Castellano money, Seamus said, $80,000 that a man trusted us to protect, money that was supposed to help him retire, help his children start businesses, help his grandchildren go to college. We can't pay that back, Patrick said. We don't have that kind of cash. I know we can't, but that's not the point. Seamus's voice was flat, controlled. The point is that someone came onto our streets, stopped our truck, put a gun in my son's face, and took what didn't belong to them. And if we let that stand, we're finished. Everyone will know that the Malones can be robbed, that we're weak, that we can't protect our clients or ourselves. What are you suggesting? Declan asked. I'm suggesting we find out who did this, and then we make sure they never do it again. Pa, these are Colombo people. We can't go to war with the mafia. We're not going to war. We're going hunting. Seamus's eyes found each of his family members in turn. I spent 20 years on those docks. I know people. Longshoremen, teamsters, men who hate the Italians as much as we do. I know where information flows, where loyalties lie, where pressure can be applied. We find the men who did this. We find out who they work for. And we deal with them one at a time. Deal with them how? Seamus didn't answer immediately. He walked to the window, looked out at the trucks parked in the loading area, at the warehouse that represented everything his family had built. I buried a son in Korea. I buried a wife who worked herself to death, helping me build this business. I've spent 40 years in this neighborhood, watching the vultures pick it clean, watching good people get squeezed by men who've never done an honest day's work in their lives. He turned back to face his family. I'm 67 years old. I don't have much time left, and I don't have much to lose. But I have enough to make sure these men understand that some things have a cost. Pa, I'm not asking permission. I'm asking for help. If you're not willing to give it, I'll do this alone. The silence stretched for a long moment. It was Connor who spoke first. The nephew, 50 years old, who had lost his own father to a waterfront accident that everyone knew wasn't accidental. I'm with you, Uncle Seamus, whatever it takes. One by one, the others nodded. Declan, Patrick, Brendan, 5 men. One decision. 14 lives in the balance. Michael Reeves spent 3 weeks verifying Kowalski's account. He found the missing persons reports, 14 files, all from the 72nd Precinct, all marked closed without resolution. The names matched what Kowalski had told him. Soldiers in the Benedetto crew, men with criminal records dating back decades, connected to crimes ranging from assault to extortion to suspected murder. He found newspaper clippings from 1973 and 1974, brief mentions of disappearances that had attracted little attention in a city where violence was so common that 14 missing mobsters barely registered. He found the property records for Malone Brothers Moving and Storage, confirming that the company had operated from 1945 until 1987, when Declan Malone had sold the warehouse and retired. And he found something else, a name that Kowalski hadn't mentioned, buried in one of the police reports, Thomas Malone, Seamus's younger brother, who had died in 1958 in what was officially ruled an industrial accident on the Red Hook docks. The report noted that Thomas had been a union organizer, that he had been vocal in his opposition to mob influence in the International Longshoremen's Association, that he had received threats in the weeks before his death. The death had been ruled accidental, a crane malfunction, a falling container, a tragedy that could happen to anyone who worked the dangerous waterfront. But Michael knew better now. He understood what had driven Seamus Malone, what had fueled a rage that had been building for 15 years before the truck theft gave it a target. The Malones hadn't just been defending their business. They had been avenging their dead. The investigation began the morning after the theft. Seamus had contacts throughout Red Hook, men he had worked with on the docks, men who owed him favors, men who shared his hatred of the Italian crews that had dominated the neighborhood for decades. He started making calls, asking questions, gathering information that moved through channels the police couldn't access. The license plate Patrick had memorized was traced within 24 hours. The car belonged to a man named Anthony Fazio, 32 years old, a known associate of the Benedetto crew. Fazio lived in Carroll Gardens with his wife and 2 children, drove a Cadillac he couldn't afford on his legitimate income, and was known to handle collections for Salvatore Benedetto's loan sharking operation. Fazio's a soldier, Seamus reported to his family. Mid-level guy, does what he's told. He wasn't the one who planned the hijacking. He was just muscle. But he knows who gave the order, and he knows where the money went. How do we get to him? Brendan asked. We watch. We wait. We find the moment when he's vulnerable. Seamus spread a hand-drawn map across the desk. Red Hook streets, marked with locations he had identified through his network. Fazio has patterns. He drinks at a bar on Court Street every Thursday night. He visits his mother in Bensonhurst on Sundays. He makes collections on Tuesdays and Fridays, usually alone. We grab him on a collection run. Too risky, too many witnesses, too many things that could go wrong. We take him when he's alone, when no one's expecting trouble, when we can control the situation. Seamus tapped a location on the map. There's a warehouse on Coffee Street, abandoned since the shipping companies left. We bring him there, we ask our questions, and we find out who else was involved. And then we make a decision about what comes next. Anthony Fazio was taken on a Tuesday night. He had been making collections in Red Hook, visiting the businesses that paid protection to the Benedetto crew. A bodega on Columbia Street, a hardware store on Van Brunt, a bar on Dykeman that had been paying $200 a week for 15 years. It was routine work, the kind of thing Fazio had done hundreds of times without incident. He never saw the van coming. Brendan was driving, a nondescript Ford Econoline that the Malones used for small deliveries. Connor handled the grab, stepping out of an alley as Fazio walked toward his Cadillac, pressing a chloroform-soaked rag over his face before the mobster could reach for the pistol in his waistband. Fazio was unconscious within seconds. They loaded him into the van, bound his hands and feet with rope, covered him with moving blankets. The entire operation took less than 90 seconds. No witnesses, no complications, no evidence that Anthony Fazio had been anywhere near the corner of Dykeman and Van Brunt. The warehouse on Coffee Street was exactly as Seamus had described, abandoned, forgotten, invisible to anyone who didn't know it existed. The Malone family had used it for overflow storage in the 1960s before the shipping industry collapsed, and the building's owners stopped paying taxes. Now it belonged to no one, maintained by no one, visited by no one. The perfect place for a conversation that no one would hear. Michael Reeves found the warehouse in his 3rd week of investigation. The building was still standing, barely. The roof had partially collapsed, the windows were shattered, and vegetation had begun to reclaim the loading dock. But the structure was recognizable from the property records Michael had obtained, and the location matched what Kowalski had described. He walked through the ruins, trying to imagine what had happened here 50 years earlier. The concrete floor was stained with substances he preferred not to identify. The walls were covered with graffiti from decades of trespassers. Whatever evidence might have existed had long since been destroyed by time and weather and the city's indifference. But the building still felt heavy somehow, weighted with history that hadn't fully dissipated. Michael took photographs, made notes, and drove back to Manhattan to continue his research. He had more questions for Kowalski, questions about what had happened in this warehouse, questions about how a family of movers had transformed into something else entirely. Kowalski was waiting for him when he arrived at the nursing home. "You found the Coffee Street building," the old detective said. It wasn't a question. "How did you know?" "Because that's where it started. The first one, Fazio, that's where they took him. That's where they got the information they needed to find the others." "What happened to him?" Kowalski was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on something Michael couldn't see. The Malones weren't cruel men. They weren't sadists who enjoyed causing pain. But they needed information, and Fazio had it, so they did what was necessary to get it. They tortured him. They persuaded him. There's a difference, at least in degree. They didn't hurt him for pleasure. They hurt him until he told them what they needed to know. Names, locations, the structure of the Benedetto crew, who had participated in the truck hijacking, who had ordered it, where the money had gone. And then they killed him, quickly without ceremony, a single blow to the head, the way you'd put down an animal that was suffering. They weren't monsters, Mr. Reeves. They were men who had made a decision about what justice required, and they carried it out as humanely as the circumstances allowed. The interrogation of Anthony Fazio lasted 4 hours. Seamus conducted it personally, drawing on skills he had developed during 20 years on the waterfront. Years of dealing with hard men, of navigating conflicts that couldn't be resolved through official channels, of understanding how to apply pressure that produced results. Fazio resisted at first. He was a made-man soldier, trained to keep his mouth shut, conditioned to believe that loyalty to the organization was more important than personal survival. He cursed, he threatened, he promised retribution that would destroy the Malone family. Then Seamus showed him the photograph of Liam, my son, 21 years old when he died in Korea. He believed in something, duty, honor, the idea that good men had to stand up against evil. He gave his life for that belief. Seamus's voice was calm, almost gentle. I've already lost a son, Mr. Fazio. I've already lost a brother. I've already lost everything that matters except this business and the family that runs it. You can't threaten me with anything I haven't already survived. Fazio's resistance began to crumble. What I can promise you, Seamus continued, is that the information you provide will determine how this ends. Help me find the men who robbed my truck, and this ends quickly. Refuse, and it ends slowly. Either way, it ends. The only question is how much you suffer before it does. By midnight, Fazio had provided everything. The hijacking had been ordered by Salvatore Benedetto personally. After receiving a tip that the Castellano money would be in the truck, the actual operation had been carried out by 3 men, Fazio himself, a driver named Vincent Carbone, and an enforcer named Paul Scarpa. The money had been taken to Benedetto's social club on Union Street, where it had been divided according to the organization's standard formula. Fazio also provided something more valuable, a complete breakdown of the Benedetto crew, 14 men in total, including Benedetto himself. Names, addresses, routines, the information that would allow the Malones to hunt them systematically. You'll let me go now? Fazio asked when he had nothing left to offer. I told you everything. I cooperated. Seamus looked at the man who had put a gun in his son's face, who had stolen from a client who trusted the Malone family, who represented everything that had been poisoning Red Hook for decades. I appreciate your cooperation, truly. The killing was quick, as Kowalski had described, a single blow with a pipe wrench that ended Anthony Fazio's life before he could feel fear. Declan and Patrick wrapped the body in canvas, loaded it into the van, drove to a construction site on the waterfront, where concrete was being poured for a new pier. By dawn, Anthony Fazio was part of Brooklyn's infrastructure, buried beneath tons of concrete that would never be disturbed. 1 down, 13 to go. The disposal methods were clever, Kowalski said. The Malones knew the city, knew the construction sites, the abandoned buildings, the places where bodies could disappear. They used different locations for each victim, different methods, making it almost impossible to establish a pattern. Almost. I established the pattern eventually, but by then, the killings were over, and I had to decide what to do with what I knew. Kowalski shifted in his chair. The construction sites were the most common. New York in 1973 was being rebuilt. Highways, bridges, housing projects. There was always concrete being poured somewhere, always foundations being dug. The Malones knew the schedules, knew which sites had minimal supervision, knew how to access them without being seen. They had inside knowledge. Seamus had spent 20 years on the docks. He knew the construction unions, had friends in the right places, understood how the city worked at a level that most people never see. That knowledge made him dangerous, made the whole family dangerous. What about the other disposal methods? The East River mostly. Bodies weighted and dropped from boats in areas where the currents would carry them out to sea. A few were never found. We assumed cremation, probably at an industrial furnace somewhere in the city. The Malones were thorough. They didn't want evidence surfacing months or years later. And the police never connected the disappearances? We connected them eventually, but by then the Malones had established alibis, had cleaned up their operation, had become invisible again. And more importantly, by then I had started to understand what was really happening, that this wasn't random violence, but a systematic response to years of abuse. Vincent Carbone was the second victim. He was the driver who had stolen the Malone truck, the man who had actually sat behind the wheel and driven away with $95,000 in cargo and cash. Fazio had provided his address, his schedule, his habits, everything the Malones needed to plan an approach. Carbone lived in a walk-up apartment in Carroll Gardens' 3rd floor, accessible by a fire escape that overlooked an alley. He worked irregular hours, but he had one consistent pattern. Every Saturday morning, he walked to a bakery on Court Street for coffee and pastries, a ritual he had maintained for years. The Malones took him on a Saturday morning in late October. Patrick and Connor handled the grab, intercepting Carbone in the alley behind his building as he left for his weekly ritual. The chloroform worked as efficiently as it had on Fazio, and within minutes, Carbone was in the back of a van, heading toward an abandoned factory in Sunset Park. The interrogation was shorter this time. The Malones already had most of the information they needed. Carbone's role was to confirm what Fazio had told them, to fill in gaps, to provide additional details about the Benedetto operation. Carbone confirmed everything and added something new: the identity of the informant who had tipped off the crew about the Castellano money. It was one of Castellano's employees, a kid named Tommy Russo, worked at the grocery store for 3 years. He overheard Castellano talking about the sale, about taking cash, about using the Malones to move it. He sold the information to Benedetto for $500. Where do we find Russo? He's gone, left the city right after the hijacking. Scared someone would figure out he was the leak. I heard he went to Florida, maybe Miami. The Malones noted the information but didn't pursue it. Russo was a peripheral player, a kid who had made a stupid decision for quick money. The real targets were the men who had actually carried out the theft, and the organization that had ordered it. Carbone joined Fazio in Brooklyn's hidden infrastructure, this time at a housing project foundation in Brownsville, where concrete was being poured for a building that would stand for decades. 2 down, 12 to go. Michael Reeves found the construction records from 1973 and 1974. The city had been engaged in massive building projects during that era, part of an effort to address the housing shortage and revitalize neighborhoods that had been devastated by decades of disinvestment. The records showed dozens of sites where concrete had been poured during the 4-month window when the Benedetto crew was disappearing. Cross-referencing the dates of the disappearances with the construction schedules produced several matches. Sites where work had been ongoing during the nights when specific individuals had vanished. It wasn't proof, but it was circumstantial evidence that supported Kowalski's account. The detective had been telling the truth. The Malones had buried their victims in the foundations of buildings that now house thousands of New Yorkers. Michael drove to one of the sites, a public housing complex in Brownsville that had been completed in 1974. The building was showing its age, weathered by decades of use and inadequate maintenance, but it was still standing, still occupied, still serving the purpose for which it had been built. Somewhere beneath the foundation, if Kowalski's account was accurate, lay the remains of Vincent Carbone and possibly others. Michael stood outside the building for a long time, thinking about the layers of history beneath his feet, the violence that had been absorbed into the city's infrastructure, the secrets that were literally built into New York's foundation. The city was haunted. It had always been haunted. The only question was whether anyone wanted to know by what. Paul Scarpa was the 3rd victim, taken in early November. He was the enforcer who had pointed a gun at Patrick's face during the hijacking, the physical presence that had made resistance impossible. He was also, according to Carbone, the most dangerous member of the 3-man crew, a man with a reputation for violence that extended beyond his work for Benedetto. The Malones approached him differently. Instead of a grab, they used surveillance to identify a vulnerability. Scarpa had a girlfriend in Bay Ridge, a woman named Maria who didn't know about his wife in Carroll Gardens. He visited her every Wednesday evening, parking his car on a residential street and spending 3 hours in her apartment before returning home. Those 3 hours were more than enough. Brendan punctured Scarpa's tires while he was inside, then waited across the street in the van. When Scarpa emerged and discovered the flats, he cursed, kicked the car, and started walking toward a payphone to call for help. He never reached it. Connor emerged from a parked car, chloroform ready, and Scarpa went down without a struggle. By the time Maria wondered why her boyfriend hadn't said goodbye, he was already in the abandoned warehouse, facing questions he couldn't avoid. Scarpa was tougher than the others. He took longer to break, required more persuasion before he began providing useful information. But he broke eventually, as everyone did. And the information he provided confirmed what the Malones had already learned. while adding new details about Benedetto's operation. The disposal was different this time. Scarpa's body was weighted and dropped into the East River from a boat that Connor had borrowed from a fisherman friend in Sheepshead Bay. The currents carried it toward the Atlantic, toward open water where it would never be found. 3 down, 11 to go. By November, Benedetto knew something was wrong, Kowalski said. 3 of his men had vanished without explanation, without any of the usual signs of mob conflict. No bodies found in trunks, no messages sent to rival families. Just disappearance. He didn't suspect the Malones. Why would he? They were a moving company, a family of Irish laborers who had never shown any capacity for violence. Benedetto's first assumption was that a rival crew was making moves. Maybe the Gambinos trying to expand into Red Hook. Maybe an internal power struggle he wasn't aware of. He never imagined that the targets were coming from outside the organization entirely. That worked in the Malones' favor. It worked perfectly. Benedetto started looking for enemies within the mob world, pulling resources away from his regular operations, creating chaos that made it even easier for the Malones to operate. The more men who disappeared, the more paranoid Benedetto became, and the more paranoid he became, the less attention he paid to threats from outside his world. When did he figure it out? Not until the end, not until it was far too late. The campaign continued through November and into December. The Malones had developed a system by now: surveillance, planning, execution, disposal. Each operation was different in its specifics, adapted to the particular target and circumstances, but the underlying pattern remained consistent. They never rushed, never took unnecessary risks, never left evidence that could be traced back to them. 4 more men disappeared in November. Rocco Amato, a collector who had beaten a shopkeeper so badly that the man lost an eye. Taken outside a bar in Cobble Hill, disposed of at a construction site in Red Hook. Joseph DiMaggio, no relation to the baseball player, a driver who transported stolen goods for the Benedetto crew. Taken from his car in a parking garage, disposed of in the East River. Frank Esposito, an enforcer with 3 assault convictions and a suspected murder that had never been prosecuted. Taken from his apartment building, disposed of at a foundation pour in East New York. Michael Russo, different from Tommy Russo, the informant, a numbers runner who had been with Benedetto for 15 years. Taken on his collection route, disposed of at a construction site in Canarsie. Each disappearance increased the pressure on Benedetto's organization. The remaining soldiers were nervous, looking over their shoulders, afraid to maintain their normal routines. Collections dropped off as enforcers stayed home, rather than risk becoming the next victim. The entire operation was crumbling from within, and the Malones were just getting started. The psychological warfare was almost as effective as the killings, Kowalski observed. By December, Benedetto's crew was paralyzed. Men who had terrorized the neighborhood for years were afraid to leave their homes. The protection payments stopped flowing because there was no one to collect them. The loan sharking operation collapsed because the enforcers were too scared to make their rounds. The Malones broke them without ever confronting them directly. That was the genius of it. Seamus understood that fear was a more powerful weapon than violence. He didn't just want to kill these men. He wanted to destroy their organization, their sense of security, their belief that they were untouchable. And he succeeded. By Christmas 1973, the Benedetto crew was a shell of what it had been. But there were still more targets. 7 more, the remaining soldiers, the lieutenants, and Benedetto himself. The Malones saved him for last, just as you might expect. They wanted him to know what was coming, to experience the fear that he had inflicted on others for so many years. Did he try to run? He tried everything. He brought in outside muscle from other families. He went to the Colombo leadership asking for help. He even tried to negotiate, sent word through intermediaries that he was willing to return the money, to pay reparations, to do whatever was necessary to make peace. The Malones refused. The Malones never responded. They just kept hunting. One by one, Benedetto's remaining men vanished. By mid-January, he was alone, the last survivor of a crew that had once numbered 14. And then, they came for him. December 1973 was the coldest month in New York in 15 years. The temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there, turning the city into a landscape of gray ice and bitter wind. The streets of Red Hook were nearly empty after dark. residents hurrying between heated spaces, unwilling to spend more time outside than absolutely necessary. The cold worked in the Malones' favor. Fewer witnesses on the streets, fewer complications, fewer variables to account for when planning operations that required precision and timing. The winter became an ally, providing cover that made their work easier and their targets more vulnerable. 3 more men disappeared in December. Carmine Vitale was a lieutenant in the Benedetto crew, responsible for overseeing the numbers operation that generated a significant portion of the organization's income. He was higher in the hierarchy than the previous victims, closer to Benedetto himself, and his disappearance sent shockwaves through what remained of the crew. The Malones took him outside his mother's house in Bensonhurst on Christmas Eve. It was a calculated choice, a message that no one was safe, that family obligations provided no protection, that the hunters could reach anyone, anywhere, at any time. Vitale had come to deliver presents to his elderly mother, had stayed for dinner and conversation, had walked to his car at 10 p.m. expecting nothing more dangerous than icy roads. Connor was waiting in the shadows. The chloroform worked as efficiently as it always did, and within minutes, Vitale was in the back of a van heading toward the warehouse district. His mother would report him missing the next morning, Christmas Day, when he failed to answer his phone. The police would take a report, add it to the growing file of Benedetto crew disappearances, and do nothing. The interrogation of Vitale provided something new: the location of Benedetto's emergency safe house. "He's scared," Vitale said, blood running from a split lip. "He's been staying at a place in Staten Island, a house his wife doesn't know about. He thinks if he stays away from Brooklyn, he'll be safe. Address?" Vitale provided it, hoping cooperation might earn him mercy. It didn't. His body was disposed of at a construction site in the Bronx, the first victim buried outside Brooklyn, a sign that the Malones were expanding their operational range as they closed in on their final target. Michael Reeves drove to Staten Island on a gray February afternoon. The address Kowalski had provided, the same address Vitale had given the Malones 50 years earlier, corresponded to a modest house in a residential neighborhood near the Verrazzano Bridge. The house had changed hands multiple times since 1973, was currently owned by a young family with no connection to organized crime, and showed no signs of its history. But Michael stood on the sidewalk anyway, imagining what it must have been like for Salvatore Benedetto in those final weeks, hiding in a house miles from his territory, watching his organization collapse, knowing that something was hunting his men, but unable to identify what. The fear must have been overwhelming. Kowalski had described Benedetto as a man who had terrorized others for 20 years, who had built his reputation on the ability to inflict pain and fear without consequence. Now that same man was experiencing what his victims had felt: the helplessness, the uncertainty, the knowledge that violence could arrive at any moment. It was justice of a sort, rough justice delivered by men who had no legal authority, but who had suffered enough to claim a moral one. Michael took photographs of the house, made notes, and drove back to Brooklyn. He had more questions for Kowalski, questions about the final days of the Benedetto crew, about how it ended, about whether Seamus Malone had ever expressed regret. The 10th victim was taken on New Year's Eve. His name was Dominic Gallo, and he was Benedetto's driver, the man who transported the capo from location to location, who knew his schedule and his hiding places, who represented the last layer of protection between Benedetto and the hunters who were closing in. Gallo was celebrating the new year at a party in Bay Ridge, surrounded by people who had no idea what was happening to his organization. He drank too much, as he always did on holidays, and left the party around 2 a.m. to drive home. He never arrived. Patrick and Brendan intercepted him 3 blocks from the party, forcing his car to the curb with a maneuver that looked like a minor traffic accident. By the time Gallo realized what was happening, it was too late. Connor was at his window, chloroform ready, and 1974 began with another disappearance. The interrogation confirmed what the Malones already suspected. Benedetto was alone now, isolated in his Staten Island safe house, protected by nothing except fear and desperation. His driver was gone, his lieutenants were gone, his soldiers were gone. The organization that had taken decades to build had been dismantled in less than 4 months. "He knows you're coming," Gallo said. "He's got guns, he's got money, he's waiting for you. He says he'll kill anyone who tries to get to him." Seamus listened to this information without expression. Let him wait. Let him think about what's coming. We're not in a hurry. Gallo's body was weighted and dropped into the Hudson River from a boat that Declan had rented in New Jersey. The currents would carry it toward the harbor, toward the open sea, toward oblivion. 10 down. 4 to go. January was the endgame, Kowalski said. The Malones had eliminated everyone around Benedetto, his soldiers, his lieutenants, his driver. The only people left were Benedetto himself and 3 associates who had gone into hiding with him. Associates? His underboss, a man named Salvatore Conti, his consigliere, Anthony Marchetti, and his nephew, a kid named Vincent Benedetto Jr., who was being groomed to take over the operation. Kowalski shook his head slowly. They thought they were safe in Staten Island. They thought if they stayed hidden long enough, the threat would pass. They were wrong. They were wrong. The Malones had been planning this from the beginning, the systematic elimination of the entire crew, culminating in Benedetto himself. They weren't going to stop until every man responsible for the truck hijacking and every man who had enabled it was dead. How did they find the safe house? Vitale gave them the address. After that, it was just a matter of planning. The Malones spent 2 weeks watching the house, learning the routines, identifying the security measures. Benedetto had made it a fortress, armed guards, reinforced doors, a plan for what to do if someone tried to breach the perimeter. But it wasn't enough. Nothing would have been enough. Seamus Malone had been planning this for months, had been studying his enemy, had been preparing for every contingency. Benedetto was thinking like a mobster, expecting a frontal assault, a show of force, the kind of violence that characterized mob conflicts. The Malones were thinking like hunters. The surveillance of the Staten Island house began on January 5th, 1974. The Malones worked in shifts, watching the property from rented cars and borrowed vans, documenting every movement, every delivery, every pattern that might reveal a vulnerability. The house was well protected. Benedetto had learned from the disappearances, had fortified his position, had created defensive measures that would make a direct assault suicidal. But no defense was perfect. The house had a weakness. It depended on supplies, food, water, fuel for the generators that provided backup power. Someone had to leave periodically to obtain these necessities, and that someone was usually Vincent Benedetto Jr. The nephew was 23 years old, inexperienced despite his family connections, assigned to supply runs because he was the most expendable member of the group. He made trips to a grocery store in nearby Rosebank, always armed, always nervous, always watching for threats that he wasn't sophisticated enough to recognize. The Malones took him on January 12th. The grab happened in the grocery store parking lot, in broad daylight, with witnesses who saw nothing suspicious. Brendan approached the nephew as he loaded groceries into his car, asked for directions to the Verrazzano Bridge, and kept him distracted long enough for Connor to come up from behind. The chloroform, the van, the warehouse. Vincent Jr. was the youngest victim, and he broke faster than any of the others. He provided everything: the layout of the house, the defensive positions, the routines of the 3 remaining men. He begged for his life, offered money, promised to disappear forever if they would just let him go. Seamus listened to the young man's pleas with something approaching pity. You chose this life. You chose to join an organization that preys on working people, that steals and extorts and destroys. You could have been something else, could have gone to college, started a legitimate business, built something real. Instead, you chose to be a parasite. I didn't choose anything. I was born into this. We're all born into circumstances we didn't choose. What matters is what we do with them. Seamus stood, moving toward the door. I was born poor, in a neighborhood controlled by men like your uncle. I could have joined them, could have taken the easy path. Instead, I built something honest. That's the difference between us. Please, I'm only 23. My son Liam was 21 when he died in Korea. He died fighting for something he believed in. You're dying because of choices you made and choices your uncle made. There's no comparison. Vincent Benedetto Jr. was buried at a construction site in Jersey City. The first victim disposed of outside New York, a final expansion of the Malones' operational range. 11 down, 3 to go. Michael Reeves found the nephew's missing persons report in the Staten Island archives. The file was thin, a single page noting that Vincent Benedetto Jr. had been reported missing by his mother on January 14, 1974, 2 days after his disappearance. The investigation had been minimal, the case closed within weeks, with a notation that the missing man was believed to have fled the jurisdiction to avoid prosecution for unspecified criminal activities. No one had looked very hard for a missing mobster's nephew. No one had cared. Michael added the file to his growing collection of evidence: 14 missing persons reports, 14 closed cases, 14 victims who had been erased from history by a family of Brooklyn movers. He called Kowalski with a question that had been bothering him. The Malones took 14 men over 4 months. That's roughly one every 8 or 9 days. How did they maintain that pace without anyone noticing? They had cover, Kowalski replied. They were still running the moving business, still making deliveries, still appearing to be exactly what they had always been. The killings happened at night, on weekends, during hours when they could disappear without raising suspicion. And remember, this was 1970s New York. People disappeared all the time. The city was so chaotic that 14 missing mobsters barely registered. And the disposal sites. Construction was happening everywhere. The city was being rebuilt, and the Malones had connections in the building trades. They knew which sites had minimal supervision, which foremen could be trusted to look the other way, which schedules allowed access during off hours. It was almost too easy. Almost. Nothing is ever completely easy, but the Malones made it look easy, and that's what mattered. By the time anyone might have connected the disappearances, the evidence was buried under tons of concrete or scattered across the ocean floor. The final assault was planned for January 19, 1974. The information from Vincent Jr. had provided everything the Malones needed: the exact layout of the house, the positions of the 3 remaining men, the weapons they carried, the routines they followed. Benedetto, Conti, and Marchetti were trapped in a fortress of their own making, unable to leave, unable to call for help, waiting for an attack that they believed they could survive. Seamus had other plans. "We don't attack the house," he told his family during the final planning session. "We bring them out." "How?" "Fire. The house next door is vacant. Been empty for 6 months, owner trying to sell. We start a fire there, something that looks accidental. When the flames spread, when the smoke gets thick enough, they'll have to evacuate. And we'll be waiting. That's risky. What if they don't come out? Then they burn. Either way, this ends." The operation began at 3 a.m. on January 19th. Declan started the fire in the vacant house, using accelerants that would ensure rapid spread while appearing consistent with an electrical fault. The flames caught quickly, climbing the walls, generating smoke that began to drift toward the Benedetto safe house. Within 20 minutes, the fire had spread to the fence separating the 2 properties. Within 30, smoke was seeping into the safe house through gaps in the windows and doors. Within 45, the heat was becoming unbearable. Salvatore Benedetto had a choice: stay and burn or flee and face whatever was waiting outside. He chose to flee. The 3 men emerged from the back door at 4:15 a.m., coughing from smoke, weapons drawn, expecting an ambush. They got one. Patrick and Connor were positioned behind a garden shed, with clear sight lines to the exit. Brendan covered the side yard. Seamus and Declan blocked the path to the street. There was nowhere to run. The final confrontation lasted less than 5 minutes, Kowalski said. Benedetto and his men tried to fight, opened fire as soon as they saw the Malones, tried to shoot their way out, but they were disoriented from the smoke, caught in a crossfire they couldn't escape. It was over almost before it began. The Malones killed them all 3, Benedetto, Conti, and Marchetti. Shot them in the yard behind that house, then loaded the bodies into a van and drove away before the fire department arrived. Kowalski paused. The fire was ruled accidental, electrical fault, just as Seamus had planned. The bodies were never found. The safe house burned to the ground, destroying any evidence of what had happened there. 14 men in 4 months. 14 men who had terrorized Red Hook for years. 14 men who had stolen, extorted, beaten, and killed without consequence. 14 men who discovered that there are some people you shouldn't rob, some families you shouldn't threaten, some debts that can only be paid in blood. And then the Malones went back to work, They returned to their warehouse, resumed their moving business, acted as if nothing had happened. By February 1974, it was like the Benedetto crew had never existed. And you? What did you do? Kowalski was quiet for a long moment, his aged eyes distant. I did what I thought was right. I closed the cases. I buried the files. And I let Red Hook have the peace it had earned. The aftermath was quieter than anyone expected. The Colombo family conducted its own investigation into the disappearance of Benedetto and his crew, but found nothing. No witnesses, no evidence, no trail that led anywhere useful. The assumption became that a rival organization had eliminated Benedetto as part of some larger power play, a theory that was easier to accept than the truth. No one suspected the Malones. They were too small, too insignificant, too far outside the world of organized crime to be considered serious suspects. The idea that a family of Irish movers could systematically eliminate 14 made men was so implausible that it was never seriously entertained. And so, life in Red Hook returned to something approaching normal. The protection payments stopped because there was no one to collect them. The loan sharking dried up because there was no one to enforce the debts. The businesses that had been squeezed for decades suddenly found themselves free to operate without interference. It was like emerging from a long winter into unexpected spring. The Malones never discussed what they had done. Not with each other, not with anyone outside the family. The events of those 4 months became a shared secret, acknowledged only in glances and silences, in the weight that each man carried differently but equally. They had become killers. They had become executioners. They had become something that none of them had ever expected to be. And they had to live with that for the rest of their lives. The Malone brothers' moving and storage continued operating for another 13 years. To the outside world, nothing had changed. The green truck still rolled through Brooklyn streets. The warehouse on Van Brunt Street still stored furniture and belongings. The family still showed up for work every morning, as they had for decades. The business that Seamus had built from nothing continued to serve the community, continued to employ workers, continued to be exactly what it had always appeared to be. But something had changed inside the men who ran it. Seamus grew quieter in the years after January 1974. He delegated more responsibility to his sons, spent more time in his office staring at the photograph of Liam, attended Mass with a regularity that surprised everyone who knew him. He never spoke about what they had done, not directly, not even in the privacy of family gatherings, but the weight of it was visible in his eyes, in the way he moved, in the silences that stretched longer each year. He died on March 15, 1982, at 76 years old. A heart attack, the doctors said. Sudden, unexpected, the kind of death that came without warning. His sons found him in his office, slumped over his desk, the photograph of Liam clutched in his hand. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, neighbors, customers, workers, the community that Seamus had served for nearly 4 decades. The priest spoke of a man who had built something from nothing, who had provided for his family, who had resisted the corruption that plagued his neighborhood. He didn't mention the 14 men buried in the foundations of New York City. He didn't know about them. Almost no one did. Michael Reeves visited the cemetery where Seamus Malone was buried. Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, one of the oldest and most beautiful burial grounds in America. The Malone family plot occupied a modest corner near the eastern edge, marked by simple headstones that listed names and dates without elaboration. Seamus Malone, 1906-1982. His wife, buried beside him. 1910-1962. Liam Malone, 1930-1951, Korea. 3 generations of loss, 3 headstones in a row. 3 lives that had ended too soon. Michael stood before them for a long time, thinking about the weight of history that this family had carried, the decisions they had made, the consequences they had lived with. He had spent 3 months researching the Malone story, had interviewed Kowalski multiple times, had verified every detail that could be verified. The picture that emerged was complex, neither simple heroism nor simple villainy, but something in between. The Malones had been ordinary men pushed to extraordinary actions. They had responded to theft and intimidation with violence that exceeded anything their enemies might have expected. They had become executioners, had taken 14 lives, had buried their victims in the infrastructure of a city that would never know what lay beneath its streets. Were they justified? The question had no easy answer. The men they killed had been criminals, thieves, extortionists, enforcers who had terrorized a neighborhood for years. The legal system had failed to stop them, had failed to protect the community, had failed to deliver the justice that ordinary people deserved. The Malones had filled that vacuum, had done what the law couldn't or wouldn't do. But they had also appointed themselves judge, jury, and executioner. They had denied their victims any chance of redemption, any possibility of legal process, any hope of mercy. They had decided that certain lives were forfeit, and they had enforced that decision with brutal efficiency. Michael didn't know how to reconcile these truths. He suspected no one could. Detective Francis Kowalski died on April 3, 2022. He was 85 years old, the last surviving witness to the investigation that had uncovered the Malone killings. He had spent 50 years carrying the secret, 50 years living with the decision he had made, 50 years wondering whether justice had been served or denied. Michael visited him 3 days before the end. Kowalski was weak by then, barely able to speak, his body finally surrendering to the age that his mind had resisted for so long. But his eyes were still clear, still sharp, still carrying the intelligence that had made him a good detective in an era when good detectives were rare. "I have one more question," Michael said. "The question I've been avoiding since we started talking." "Ask it. Do you regret what you did, burying the investigation, letting the Malones walk free?" Kowalski was quiet for a long moment, his breathing labored, his gaze fixed on something Michael couldn't see. "I've asked myself that question every day for 50 years, and the answer has changed depending on when I asked it." He paused, gathering strength. "In the beginning, I was certain I had done the right thing. The neighborhood was peaceful. The victims were criminals. Justice had been served, even if it wasn't the kind of justice that comes with a badge in a courtroom. And later, I started to doubt. I wondered if I had set a precedent, if my silence had encouraged others to take the law into their own hands. I wondered if the families of the dead deserved to know what had happened, deserved closure even if their relatives were mobsters. I wondered if I had betrayed my oath, my badge, everything I was supposed to stand for. What do you think now?" Kowalski's eyes found Michael's, holding his gaze with surprising intensity. "Now, I think that the world is more complicated than the rules we create to govern it. I think that ordinary people, pushed far enough, are capable of extraordinary things, both terrible and necessary. I think that the Malones did what they believed was right, and I did what I believed was right, and whether either of us was actually right is a question that can't be answered. That's not very satisfying. No, it's not. But it's honest." Kowalski's voice was fading. "Write your book, Mr. Reeves. Tell the story as truthfully as you can. Let the readers decide what they think about justice and vengeance and the line between them. That's all any of us can do, tell the truth and trust others to make sense of it." He died 3 days later, taking his certainties and his doubts to the same grave. The Malone sons outlived their father by varying margins. Connor, the cousin, died first, a stroke in 1985 at 62 years old. He had never married, had never had children, had devoted his life to the family business and the secret that bound him to it. His death was mourned quietly, privately, by a family that had learned to keep its grief contained. Declan sold the business in 1987, 2 years after Connor's death. He was 59 years old, tired of the work, tired of the memories, tired of walking past the warehouse where they had planned operations that resulted in 14 deaths. He moved to Florida, to a retirement community near Tampa, where he lived until 1998 when lung cancer claimed him at 70. Patrick stayed in Brooklyn, unable or unwilling to leave the neighborhood where he had spent his entire life. He worked various jobs after the business was sold: security guard, building superintendent, the kind of work that kept him busy without requiring much thought. He died in 2003, at 70 years old, of complications from diabetes that he had ignored for too long. Brendan, the youngest, lived the longest. He moved to Boston in 1990, started a new life far from Brooklyn, married a woman who knew nothing about his past. He worked as a consultant for moving companies, using the expertise he had developed over decades without ever mentioning what else he had done during those years. He died in 2011, at 73, surrounded by a family that had no idea what secrets he carried. By 2022, when Michael Reeves began his investigation, Every Malone who had participated in the killings was dead. The last witnesses were gone. The last participants were buried. The last people who knew the full truth had taken it to their graves. Only the story remained, and Michael was determined to tell it. The book was published in September 2023. It was titled The Red Hook Silence, and it told the story of the Malone family, the Benedetto crew, and the 4 months in 1973-1974 when 14 men disappeared from the streets of Brooklyn. Michael had spent 18 months researching and writing, had verified every detail that could be verified, had presented the evidence as fairly and completely as he knew how. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some reviewers praised the book as a revelation, a previously unknown chapter of New York history that illuminated the desperation of the 1970s and the failures of the criminal justice system. They called the Malones tragic heroes, ordinary men who had been forced into extraordinary circumstances and had responded with a courage that the authorities lacked. Others condemned it as an apology for vigilante violence, a romanticization of murder that ignored the fundamental injustice of killing without trial. They pointed out that the Malone victims, however criminal, had rights that had been violated by men who appointed themselves executioners without authority or accountability. The families of the victims had mixed reactions. Some were grateful for closure, finally learning what had happened to fathers and uncles and brothers who had vanished 50 years earlier. They didn't excuse their relatives' crimes, but they appreciated knowing the truth, having something concrete to mourn rather than endless uncertainty. Others were furious. They demanded investigations, prosecutions, justice for men who had been murdered by a family that had never faced consequences. They filed lawsuits that went nowhere, contacted authorities who had no interest in reopening cases that had been closed for half a century. The construction sites where the bodies were buried remained undisturbed. No one was going to tear down housing projects and office buildings to search for 50-year-old remains. The dead stayed where they were, part of New York's infrastructure, silent witnesses to a violence that the city had absorbed and forgotten. Michael Reeves gave a lecture at Columbia University 6 months after the book's publication. The auditorium was packed, students, professors, journalists, citizens interested in a story that had captured the public imagination. Michael stood at the podium, looking out at faces that expected answers he wasn't sure he could provide. "The question everyone asks," he began, "is whether the Malones were right, whether what they did was justice or murder, whether they should be condemned or celebrated." He paused, letting the question hang in the air. "I've spent 2 years thinking about that question, and I've come to believe that it's the wrong question to ask." The Malones weren't making a philosophical argument about justice. They were responding to a specific situation with the tools available to them. They had been robbed, threatened, pushed to a point where legal remedies seemed inadequate. They made a choice. We can debate that choice endlessly. We can argue about whether the circumstances justified the response, whether the victims deserved their fate, whether the outcome, a peaceful neighborhood, a dismantled criminal organization, was worth the cost. But debating the choice doesn't change the fact that it was made, that it had consequences, that it shaped lives and ended lives and left a mark on a community that persists to this day. What I've learned from this story is that justice is complicated. It's not a single thing. It's a collection of competing values, often in tension with each other. We want fairness, but we also want protection. We want process, but we also want outcomes. We want mercy, but we also want accountability. The Malones prioritize some of these values over others. The legal system prioritizes a different set. Neither approach is perfect. Neither delivers justice in every case. The question isn't which approach is right. It's which failures we're willing to accept. A student raised her hand. "Do you think they should have been prosecuted? If Kowalski had pursued the investigation, if the evidence had been preserved, do you think they should have gone to prison?" Michael considered the question carefully. "By the law as written, yes. They committed 14 murders. They should have been arrested, tried, and sentenced according to the legal framework that governs our society. The law doesn't make exceptions for sympathetic motives or deserving victims. But do I think prosecution would have served justice? That's a different question. The Malones would have spent the rest of their lives in prison for killing men who had terrorized their community for years. The message would have been that defending yourself against organized crime is more severely punished than committing it. The neighborhood that had finally found peace would have watched its protectors hauled away in handcuffs while the system that had failed them claimed victory. I don't know if that's justice. I don't think anyone does. All I know is that it's complicated, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. The warehouse on Van Brunt Street still stands. It's been converted to condominiums now, part of the gentrification that has transformed Red Hook from a working-class neighborhood into a trendy enclave of young professionals and artisanal shops. The loading dock where Malone Brothers trucks once parked is now a courtyard with planters and benches. The office where Seamus planned the elimination of the Benedetto crew is now someone's living room. Michael visited the building during his research, stood in the courtyard, tried to imagine what it had been like 50 years earlier. The ghosts were everywhere, if you knew how to look for them, in the worn bricks, in the industrial architecture, in the bones of a building that had witnessed things its current residents couldn't imagine. Red Hook itself has changed almost beyond recognition. The waterfront that once bustled with longshoremen is now lined with restaurants and galleries. The streets that Seamus Malone walked are now traveled by people who have never heard of the Benedetto crew, who have no memory of the protection rackets and the fear and the violence that defined life here for so long. But the peace persists. The neighborhood that the Malones fought to protect, through methods that can never be fully justified, but can perhaps be understood, has become something better than it was. Children play in parks where mobsters once conducted business. Families walk streets that were once too dangerous to travel after dark. Is that the Malones' legacy? Michael wasn't sure. Too many factors contributed to Red Hook's transformation to attribute it to any single cause. But he couldn't help wondering what the neighborhood would have been like if the Benedetto crew had continued operating, if the protection rackets had never ended, if the fear had never lifted. Some questions don't have answers. Some legacies can't be measured. Some stories can only be told, not resolved. Michael Reeves finished his lecture and walked out into the New York evening. The city spread around him, millions of lives intersecting in patterns too complex to comprehend. Somewhere beneath his feet, in the foundations of buildings and the beds of rivers, lay the remains of 14 men who had been erased from history by a family that believed they were delivering justice. Somewhere in Florida and Boston and Brooklyn, the descendants of the Malones went about their lives, unaware of what their fathers and grandfathers had done. Somewhere in Staten Island and Carroll Gardens and Bensonhurst, the descendants of the victims did the same. The past was buried, but it wasn't gone. It never is. Michael hailed a cab and gave the driver an address in Brooklyn. He had one more stop to make, one more place to visit before he could finally close the book on the Malone story. The cab took him to Greenwood Cemetery, to the modest corner where Seamus and Liam and the rest of the family lay. The graves were well maintained, visited by someone who still cared, still remembered, still honored the dead. Michael stood before Seamus's headstone as the sun set over Brooklyn. "I told your story," he said quietly, "as truthfully as I could. I don't know if I did it justice. I don't know if anyone could. But people know now. They know what you did and why you did it and what it cost you." The headstone didn't answer. The dead keep their silence. But somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang. The same church where Seamus had attended Mass in his final years, seeking absolution for sins he could never confess. The sound echoed across the cemetery, across the graves of 100 years of Brooklyn dead, across a city that had absorbed so much violence and somehow kept going. Michael listened until the bell fell silent. Then he turned and walked away, leaving the Malones to their rest, leaving the past to the past, leaving questions that would never be answered to echo in the spaces between memory and history. The story was told. What people made of it was up to them.